Hello and welcome to our bi-weekly regulatory show. I am Jen Sanasi here with my co-host Paul Hastings' partner, Renato Mariotti. If you are joining us for the very first time, we are live right here on CoinDesk's social channels and website. We do this every second week. We bring you insights and analysis into the latest regulatory news. Today, we are talking all about the recent Senate hearing called Exploring Bipartisan Legislative Frameworks for Digital Assets with Lightspark Chief Legal Officer Zahi Massari. Then we're going to take a look at the SEC reverse sweep, walking back enforcement actions against firms like Kraken and Coinbase with UC Berkeley lecturer Hermine Wong. And lastly, Renato and I are going to discuss Nevada threatening legal action against sports events contracts. Renato, that was a really long-winded beginning here. I got to say hi to you. How is it going?
Things are good. It is a very busy time, Jen. We obviously have the SEC Crypto Task Force asking lots of questions. I don't know if it was like 48 or 50 something questions that Hester, Commissioner Peirce, put out there. So a lot of questions out there to the industry. Obviously, the reverse sweep drawing a lot of attention. Questions about the Bitcoin Reserve. And many other things. So we have so much to pack into our show today. It's going to be quite a show.
We have so much to pack into the show, is right. CoinDesk's Nick Day talked to Hester Peirce earlier this week. We have some sound bites from her to play during the show. I spoke to former CFTC chair Tim Massid. We're going to play some sound bites from him. We have the White House Crypto Summit coming up on Friday. Renato, you and I say this every other week, but things are just moving so quickly.
Yeah, it's insane. I mean, I think it's fair to say that, the future regulatory framework for our industry is going to be rolling out in a matter of weeks, if not months. And so everybody out there who wants to do business in this space, participate in this space, now is the time to make your voice heard, because ultimately the laws and rules that you are going to have to live with for years to come are going to be determined in the next weeks and months. So this is why we have rolled out the show. It's frankly a great time to be discussing these topics, because if you're doing business in the space in any form, whether you're just trading yourself or whether you have a platform, these topics matter to you.
Yeah, now before we get to our first guest, I want to let our audience know that they have the ability to communicate with us during this show. So if you're watching us, you have a comment or a question, put it below the video. We will try to get to it throughout the show. You can also ask our guests questions via the chat, and if they are good ones, we will get to them. So let's bring in our first guest now. In her recent Senate testimony, she highlighted Bitcoin's revolutionary role in establishing a decentralized global financial infrastructure and its potential to modernize payments systems. Joining us now is Lightspark co-founder and chief legal officer Zahi Massari. Hello.
Hi guys, it's so nice to be with you today.
Of course. Now, we were just talking about how quickly everything is moving. You, of course, had a front seat at the Senate hearing that I just mentioned in my introduction. Talk to us about some of the takeaways from there. I mean, you were there in person. We were all listening to it on various different live streams. How did you leave that hearing feeling about the future of this industry?
It's a great question. I also remember testifying on stablecoins back in 2021. It felt very different this time. I think we need new stablecoin laws. My testimony was focused on stablecoins. We also talked about crypto market structure. But I have to say, I noticed a big step up from lawmakers, both in terms of their knowledge about stablecoin regulation, which is a complicated topic, but also in their interest in getting something done on legislation. The hearing was really substantive. Both members of the committee from both sides of the aisle were asking really technical, good questions. And for me, as a technical lawyer, I find that very encouraging, because it makes me think that the staffs and the members of the committee themselves are digging deeply into the important issues. And I think that's exactly what we need right now.
Yeah, one thing that I thought was very interesting is that it seemed to me that there's been a shift in the window in terms of what people expect. If you just look just a few years ago, I think there was definitely an expectation from at least one of the two parties that maybe there wouldn't be any legislation at all, and it seems like everyone has a general agreement about a framework that's going to be rolled out, and the question is really in the specifics. And what I'm curious about is how you feel about that shift, and whether you are optimistic about a legislative solution rather than a regulatory solution.
Yeah, I think first, I am optimistic about a legislative solution. I think it's become clear in the last 5 years, the last 3 years, that new laws are needed for stablecoin regulation. The existing laws in the United States are not enough. I think we also see how the EU and other countries around the world are starting to really adopt stablecoin legislation specific to the particular benefits and opportunities that stablecoins pose, but also the specific risks that they pose. And it does feel like there's a shift here in the United States from at least some significant feeling that we didn't really need new stablecoin laws, and maybe if we sort of ignored them, they would go away, to a recognition that something more needs to be done. In my testimony in particular, I talked about what is innovative about stablecoins and the potential for them to be good digital cash. And I'm really hopeful that legislation that's being considered both in the Senate and the House will be developed and furthered to really support that thesis. So I feel pretty good about the hearing. We'll see how the hearing next week and others come as well.
I ask so many people this across the CoinDesk network, but just, given your involvement in that hearing, given your involvement in the industry, are we going to get stablecoin legislation anytime soon? And what does that practically mean for stablecoin issuers here in the United States, but also globally?
It's such a good question. I'm not a betting person. I've lived in Washington, D.C. for a long time. I know much better than to bet on any legislative process at all, but I am optimistic. I think there is sort of an agreement both among policymakers as well as the industry that something is needed on this front. And I think that at least creates an environment where we can have some progress. What does that mean for stablecoin issuers? I think that the devil is really in the details, as it always is. In my mind, I'll tell you what I hope happens, at least, which is we move from a world where there are relatively few stablecoin issuers because there are real regulatory and legal risks to getting into the market, especially for existing financial institutions, to what I've called a multi-issuer world. I've written about this with one of my frequent co-authors and one of my co-founders here at Lightspark, but really a world where lots of different issuers are entering the stablecoin issuance market. No one issuer dominates the market, but instead we get competition based on payments use cases rather than, a few at-scale issuers making money off of, reserve returns. Like, that's not particularly innovative to my mind. What we really want to see is 1,000 payments use cases bloom for stablecoins. And I think setting a floor for trustworthiness for stablecoins as good digital cash will let that innovation happen in a lot more healthy and good way. We can keep our fingers crossed.
So one thing that I think has been a little frustrating to some people in the space is that although now there's renewed interest in all of these issues, there have been folks like yourself who've been proposing solutions for quite some time, and yet now it seems like it's a lot of the regulators and legislators are at square one, saying, "Okay, tell us what we should do." And I'm curious, to what extent do you think that we're going to have to reinvent the wheel a little bit over the next upcoming months to educate for the first time people in government who are approaching issues for the first time that a lot of us have been discussing for many years?
Yeah. So I'm going to fight the hypo a little bit, Renato.
Oh, wow. Okay.
In the legislation that's circulating now, both the Stable Act and the Genius Act, I see a ton of progress. I have been working on these issues for a really long time, since back to 2018 or so. And I think what these bills reflect is a lot of the work that has gone into stablecoin policy over the past 5 years. That includes work done by the Obama administration, by the first Trump administration, by the Biden administration, different presidents, working groups on stablecoins, international efforts like the FSB. I think there is a lot of sophistication in these bills, and I don't think that Congress now is starting from zero. I think where there is a real opportunity, including for those of us in the industry, is to do a better job educating and explaining why, whether it's stablecoins or crypto in general, can do better than existing financial services and existing financial infrastructure. That's something we're working on a lot at Lightspark on the Bitcoin Lightning front. But I think there still are good questions that the industry needs to do a better job in answering about real world use cases and why this technology is important and does represent sort of a step change innovation in how we can provide secure global instant financial services.
I want to change gears a little bit here and talk about something else that the industry has been, I guess, hyping up a lot, and that is the idea of the potential for the strategic Bitcoin reserve or a strategic crypto reserve. And Zai, before we get your thoughts on this, I want to throw to a clip. I spoke to former CFTC chair Tim Massad earlier this week, and here's what he had to say about these strategic reserves.
It was a bad idea when it was just Bitcoin. It's probably even a worse idea when you're starting to add some other tokens. Look, there's no national interest here. This is not like oil, which has a use case, which is why we created the strategic reserve for oil. It doesn't help our economic situation. It's not going to do anything to lower the price of eggs or increase people's wages, and it doesn't help the dollar. I see this really as a payback to a lot of the crypto people who supported him. And again, I just don't see any national interest. And I think it's bad for digital assets, quite frankly.
All right, Massad saying there that maybe this is potentially payback from President Trump to some of the crypto folks who supported him. That is obviously his opinion. But Zai, what are your thoughts? I know the Strategic Bitcoin Reserve came up at the hearing. Obviously, the hearing was headed by Senator Cynthia Lummis, who proposed the plan last year. What are your thoughts here?
Look, I think it's a really good question that Tim is asking. He's a very astute commentator, very smart on these topics. The real question is, what is the strategic interest of the country? And I would say there is a strategic interest for America in supporting an industry that develops new financial infrastructure. This is happening all over the world. It needs to happen in the United States, whether that's through a Bitcoin strategic reserve or a crypto strategic reserve or a stockpile. I'm not so sure. I also see some risks there in signaling weakness in the dollar, and I think that's something that should be avoided at all costs. And so I think the right way to think about this is, how do we promote policies in general that support innovation in the United States by Americans building here without some of the negative consequences that I think Tim was alluding to.
So one open question is the role of states and state regulatory regimes in regulating digital assets post legislation. And I'm curious what your thoughts are to the extent to which federal law should preempt or completely displace state laws that regulate digital assets, and what role, if any, you think there should be for state regulators?
Another great question, Renato. Look, we have today a system in the United States that's been functioning for quite some time. If you look to banking, if you look to payments regulation, where we have state regulators and federal regulators, we have a dual banking regulatory regime that works. Could it be improved? Of course. I think rather than from a philosophical perspective, but rather more practical perspective, when we're thinking about stablecoin issuance in particular, there's no need to rethink the entire federalist system of our regulatory framework just to regulate stablecoins. I think we can fit them quite nicely into the system that exists today without taking head on what I think is sometimes a third rail in financial regulation.
Renato foreshadowed some of the rest of our show with that question there. Now, Zai, before we let you go, I got to ask you, from your standpoint, your company is really an infrastructure company, really kind of outside of the conversation that a lot of us are having about crypto regulation here in the United States. What role do you feel Lightspark has to play in this regulatory conversation? Why is it important for you to be there as someone who represents a company that's building the infrastructure for the future of finance?
Yeah, I think what we're building at Lightspark is the sort of primal, most important use case for crypto, which is payments. That was the original vision of Satoshi Nakamoto. It's taken us time and effort and investment to build what is today a true global financial infrastructure in Bitcoin, the Lightning Network. You need all of the components, right? The technology, the global Bitcoin liquidity, wallets, exchanges, OTC dealers, hedging products. And with all of those components, Lightspark is now building sort of the last pieces of what's needed to really use the Bitcoin network for its intended purpose, which is a global, open, real-time payment network. We're really excited about that. And I think running a thread running through all of these conversations is still showing people what crypto is good for. And this is the most important use case in my view.
Zai, thank you so much for joining us today. And we'll continue to watch you. We might see you on another live stream soon.
Who knows? Thanks for having me, guys. Good to see you both.
Thank you.
That was co-founder and chief legal officer at Lightspark, Zai Massari. All right. If you are just joining us, we are live on CoinDesk's socials and CoinDesk's website. I'm Jen Sanasi, a senior anchor here at CoinDesk. That is Renato Moriarty. He's a partner at Paul Hastings. Every other week, we talk all about crypto legislation, regulation, right here on this stream. And we are going to keep it moving. Right, Renato?
Absolutely. Lots to talk about today.
Okay. All right. So we learned this week that Kraken's at the SEC plans to drop their lawsuit against the exchange. This comes after the federal regulator announced that they were dropping enforcement actions against Coinbase, Uniswap, amongst others. Joining us now is UC Berkeley lecturer Hermine Wong. Hello, friend of the show.
Hello, friend of mine. It's good to be back. I love being here.
Well, we love having you here. You are former SEC special counsel, former head of policy at Coinbase. This story involves both the SEC and Coinbase. So just talk to me about how you were watching these walkbacks and what they mean.
Yeah, I love watching it. It's like, eating popcorn and you're just like, this is like it feels like you're watching a train wreck in reverse is what's happening, right? Like we know that the first time it came out, it was a train wreck and now we're watching it in reverse, but that doesn't mean that there isn't now like another bit of a car wreck that we're going to see. Like we're witnessing it in real time. And here's why is that those cases that were brought by the SEC in the first place, they weren't good cases to begin with. The facts weren't great. These weren't slam dunks by any stretch of the imagination. And the Republican side of the House always had a good argument that like, don't do this regulation by enforcement, like put out rules. And that gives comfort to the public. Now that we're winding this back, it's good on the law, on the merits to wind it back. It's not good in the public interest in that we still don't have an answer on where is the right space for the SEC to regulate? This is now a question that's like many years overdue, and we're not getting further comfort. And we should also remember to step back and think about all of these companies that are saying that like, hey, this is a huge win for the crypto community. This huge win for us. We've fought back the very big bad wolf of the SEC and Gary Gensler. Whereas we have to remember that these same firms have had huge fines against them on the AML and compliance side and on the fraud side. That's Robinhood, that's Coinbase too, Gemini. Binance just had a $4.5 billion one, right? Like these fines are multi-million-dollar fines. So there's definitely a split on whether or not these are good actors or bad actors. No one's one or the other. But I think that the real story is that the public is kind of losing out.
It's interesting. Well, what I'm also interested, Hermine, in your take on the SEC statement this week regarding meme coins, likening them to collectibles, suggesting that they're not securities as a categorical matter. What's your take on that statement, as well as your take on what the right regulatory framework would be, or right regulator would be for meme coins?
Let's step. I love this question. I've been mulling over the same question, and I just want to step back and remember, this is a staff statement. This is the same kind of statement that the crypto industry hated with SAB 121, right? Like, and the reason why we hate it generally is that staff statements aren't regulation. And you can tell just by reading it, it's not giving you clear instructions or criteria about what meets a meme coin and what doesn't meet a meme coin, right? So now we're stuck back in this kind of hazy place of like, well, now the SEC says that meme coins aren't a security. Let's just call everything that we're doing a meme coin, right? Like is that the right response? That seems hardly like the right response. But that's where we have, like, that's the space we're occupying now, which is a little absurd on its face, that the community is going to celebrate the exact same piece of guidance functionally as SAB 121, which they hated because it was staff guidance and not a regulation. And to celebrate it now, I think is equally problematic on a merits level.
Hermine, Renato, I got to ask you, I know, Renato, you wrote an op-ed about some of the differentiations between different regulators in the United States that we can dig into a little bit later, but just hearing Hermine's response, Renato, knowing what was said in your op-ed, listening to the interview we just did, it sounds like, we keep saying there's a clearer path forward, but to me, it just sounds like there's more confusion here. It's just different confusion. And so I would love to hear from both of you. I mean, as folks who are advising firms in the space, is there just more confusion ahead that we need to kind of start to sift through before we get any kind of clarity here?
I guess, to the extent you're asking me, I would say I do think as to meme coins, there is going to be some confusion in the short run. And the reason why is because the public is noticing meme coins. They're noticing price shifting and winners and losers in certain well-publicized meme coins. And states are going to react. At least some states, blue states, are probably going to react to that. There's going to be state regulators. There's going to be state attorney generals who are going to react. And particularly if the SEC takes the position that it's just hands off and somebody else should figure that out. I mean, essentially what the SEC is saying is this is a consumer protection issue. Essentially akin to somebody defrauding people on Beanie Babies, rather than or baseball cards, rather than a securities issue. And that's interesting, but of course that means that there's a whole slew of other regulators that could enter the fore, and there might ultimately be national legislation on the subject, just to prevent a patchwork of different rulings that are inconsistent at a state level.
And if I could chime in, because Renato's piece, his op-ed was, I think, a great piece. It also makes me think about what kind of tools these state attorney generals will have, right? Because to Renato's point about the SEC punting the meme coin issue to a consumer protection issue, let's remember that the Trump administration has basically taken a hacksaw to the CFPB. So we're not going to have a national framework for consumer protection anymore. And the states will be under even more of a, ambition to enforce their own consumer protection laws, which are not the same protection laws throughout the states, right? They have different authorities, different legislation that was granted to them. So we're going to see this patchwork of enforcement that I think does not help the public, and it certainly doesn't help the industry.
Okay, so if I'm making sense of this correctly, regardless of the SEC, walking back some of these enforcement cases, we may see state regulators, attorneys general kind of pick up where the SEC left off. So Renato, I think the title of your op-ed was "The War is Not Yet Won," or "The War is Not Over." You can correct me if I'm wrong.
Right.
Yeah. So what does that mean? Does that mean that these firms, some of which I've mentioned, like Coinbase, Kraken, others, Uniswap, are not yet out of hot water?
Absolutely, I don't think they are at all. In fact, and I have heard. I mean, I've heard from some state regulators since this op-ed was published. It got republished in other publications and discussed. And I think the reason why is people haven't been paying enough attention to the fact that just because the SEC is dropping all these lawsuits doesn't mean that the New York DFS isn't going to be taking a look at your company. It doesn't mean that California now has new legislation that's been passed. Illinois is considering crypto legislation, and they all have state attorney generals who are elected officials who all want to be governor or senator or something else, who have a vested interest in protecting consumers. And so, if you have a meme coin, for example, in which there are thousands of people who lost money who are upset about it, and the federal government says they can't do anything about it, you have to believe that there are going to be some state attorney general. It only takes one, and they tend to travel in packs. So if one state attorney general decides to move on an issue, they often pair up and gang up, and then there's 20 or 30 attorney general working on a matter. That can be a serious problem for a company. And so just because you resolve your SEC issue doesn't mean that there aren't any legal issues. And when there's a vacuum, it tends to get filled by someone. And in this case, I think it's going to be the states or plaintiffs' attorneys who are going to be filing lawsuits on behalf of private individuals in states where the attorney generals aren't taking action.
I guess on the back of that comment, Hermine, I'm going to pass it to you. What does that mean for you when we look at the path ahead for crypto firms? What can we expect to see next?
Well, first, we're going to see a lot of people launching a lot of stuff as quickly as possible during this grace period, we might call it. I mean, it's like, it's weird to think about how we continue to be in a regulatory uncertainty space, but we have a lot of signal that there's no enforcement coming, which is the really costly part about operating business in a regulatory uncertain time. That is, at the federal level, Renato's point is still like really well taken, which is that the states aren't going to lift their particular feet off the gas pedal. In fact, I think that there will be certain states, the blue states in particular, who see this as an opening to again levy an attack against the Trump administration, right? Just brass tacks. This is a huge opening for them, and it'll be an easy win in the sense that there probably will be tons of people who are going to lose money in this time, right? Like retail people who are going to lose a lot of money. So I would advise that if you are a builder focused on the long term, right, you should not be looking to capture market share of people getting duped. Like that is not a good market share to try to capitalize on right now, and to continue to think about what is the long-term vision to ensure the strongest product, the strongest service you could, regardless of the current politics.
All right, lawyers, I have one more question for you. Okay, so now let's take what you both said there and bring into the mix the fact that folks like Trump, people in Trump's family, maybe even the crypto and AI czar, have their own interests in various different crypto projects. How does that come into the fold now? If we're talking about enforcement actions from state regulators, if we're talking about individual plaintiffs, is there an argument to be had here that the administration is doing it, so why can't I?
Jen, yes, obviously that is like, yes, absolutely. And you see it on crypto Twitter all the time, right? Like, I think that it's no surprise that people are making that argument. I think that what's probably more troubling that we will have to root through, years from now is just that there's a quid pro quo going on with the way that the Trump administration is operating with the announcements of its particular support of particular tokens. And I say that because the reality is that some of those projects or people who back those projects contributed a lot of money to the Trump administration. So as an example, we used to talk just about the Bitcoin strategic reserve. That was it. That seemed like, maybe a little fringe, but also on the merits, Bitcoin holds 60% of the crypto market on its own, right? That's like, whereas those other tokens, they weren't the ones that were seized in the Silk Road seizures. Those tokens are not the ones that represent a huge amount of the seizures. They are not the ones that operate at the 60% level of the market cap. So the fact that they're named is telling that this Trump administration is continuing on kind of a quid pro quo. I'll do you this favor. Time's going to come when you're going to have to do me a big favor.
Well, I mean, we'll just, like we say on this show so often, we'll just have to wait and see how things shake out from that front. I want to now bring up another story about Coinbase and the SEC. We learned this week that Coinbase filed a public records request demanding that the SEC provide records on its spending on investigations and actions against the crypto industry in recent years. And I wanted to just get your thoughts and opinions about why this might be happening. What could this signal? Why is this important to Coinbase to get this information?
So my take on this one, since I told you I had a take on this, is that I actually think Coinbase is looking forward. They're doing what a lot of people aren't doing in this industry. They've always been forward thinkers. And I think what they're thinking about is what happens when a new administration comes in and there is arguments about, or perhaps potentially a House of Congress flips. And there are questions about there's not enough enforcement in crypto, and the conversation changes. I think they want to have these dollar signs to use as talking points. And they want to say, look, millions of taxpayer dollars are spent on this, and this was a waste. And I think they want to take that history and have that studied to sort of suggest that this should never and can never happen again, because they recognize that ultimately, yes, there was an election and there's been a shift, but the political winds go back and forth, and there may be a shift again.
Hermine, what do you think?
I mean, I think that they have raised this particular issue for a long time. Like, it is obscene. I'm just parroting, right? It is obscene that the SEC and the regulators have used taxpayer money in this unlawful witch hunt, right? And we saw actually the statement coming from one of the Gemini co-founders, one of the Winklewsons, being even more stringent than that, right? That like wanting to out SEC staff and fire them immediately kind of talk that I think is actually quite dangerous. But in all of this, one of the things that I think is often missing is that the SEC, unlike some of the other agencies, is fully funded, right? This is not taxpayer dollars. It's actually funded by the fees it takes on. And it actually is one of those unusual agencies that contributes more to the general treasury than is allocated to it on a yearly basis. So, I think that Renato's right, that certainly they're going to want to have some dollar signs on that. But when it comes to the SEC, it's not a particularly convincing argument.
All right, we are going to have to leave it there, Hermine. It's always a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing those insights.
Thank you so much. I'll see you guys later.
That was UC Berkeley lecturer and former SEC special counsel, Hermine Wong. All right, Renato, the theme throughout today's show has been federal regulator versus state regulator. And this is such a fascinating topic to unpack. You posted about it on your LinkedIn. Nevada's gambling regulator is asking Kalshi to stop offering derivatives trading on sports to people in the state by March 14th. Now, according to Bloomberg, the state is the first to challenge sports-based events contracts offered by federally regulated exchanges. Before we dive into it, Renato, talk to me about what's going on here.
Well, this is very big. The sports gaming industry sees an existential threat. So sports gaming in the United States is heavily regulated. It's grown in popularity, and states, particularly Nevada, make money off of it, right? It's regulated. There's various taxes and fees and so on that are paid by these regulators. And here, Nevada is threatening not just like to file a lawsuit. They're threatening civil or criminal action against Kalshi. And Kalshi, remember, of course, that's a company that offers tokens that allow you. They're essentially event contracts that allow you to essentially place a wager on various things, whether it's an election. That's where it got a lot of attention in the run-up to this last presidential election, but on a variety of other things, such as whether there'll be an avian flu outbreak this year, or in this case, various sports things. Who's going to win the Super Bowl? Who will win the NBA Finals? Things like that. Well, if you imagine if sports event contracts in the form of tokens like Kalshi's that offering, if those become very widely traded and available, well, then all of these entities that are paying lots of money to Nevada and are heavily regulated by Nevada are going to be outcompeted by folks who are using the blockchain to provide the same thing at a national level without that level of regulation and fees and taxes. And so they're very concerned and they're threatening action. And I think this kind of brings to the fore the issue that we've been talking about throughout this, which you mentioned, Jen, state versus federal.
Yeah. So talk to me about what happens here. I mean, do you think that the CFTC looks at what Nevada is threatening here, and maybe sports contracts gets removed from regulation? Do you think that these types of events contracts could completely displace the sports betting industry? Like, what happens next?
Very interesting. Well, the CFTC announced a prediction markets roundtable. I did provide a comment letter on behalf of one of my clients and talked about it. And if you look at their questions very carefully, the acting chair, Caroline Pham, talked about and asked questions about federalism issues and whether or not there are certain areas that should be better left to the states. So she was putting that issue out there. And given some of her prior commentary, I think what she's referring to is gaming, sports gaming, and other types of gambling in particular that have been left either to Native American tribes, for example, but also to states. And you see in the comment letters, not the one I wrote, but others, from some of these groups, Native American groups, states, who gaming industry, very, very concerned about the displacement of their existing business. So I would not be surprised if the CFTC carves out sports, but still allows a lot of other event contracts. In other words, Kalshi would still be doing its political prediction markets and other type prediction markets. And I think many other competitors would enter that space, but sports might get a carve out.
I don't know if Kelshi has responded to this. I didn't see a response. Let me know if they did, and if they didn't, how do you think they're going to respond to this? Could we see, prolonged lawsuit play out in front of the courts?
Well, the CEO did respond, and he attacked this action by Nevada, as you might imagine. And I do expect legal action there. Remember, we talked about, we've been all over this issue because it's very cutting edge. Kalshi went out there and started offering the political tokens right before the election, fought the CFTC, won, and became the number one app in the App Store. I think we had the general counsel on here in a prior episode.
We did.
But the point being that I think this fight will play out, and the question is going to be: will the administration permit sports gaming? Will they not? And if they do carve it out, will Kalshi try to fight that, or potentially get legislation passed? Because this is very high stakes. All of us who watch television, or certainly if you watch sports, you see lots of sports gaming ads. The players in that industry could completely change depending on how this legislation comes out.
Do you think we're going to see other state regulators follow suit?
I do. Now, Nevada, obviously, understandably, number one, they're going to be the prime mover. But of course, other states have an interest. And like I said, there's tribal interests as well. They're making their views known to the CFTC. If the CFTC carves it out, then there might be a push by Kalshi and others for legislation. But if let's say the CFTC doesn't carve that out and permits sports gaming, which I don't expect, I think there will be a carve out. But if they didn't, I mean, I think that the Nevada would have its own, try to present its own arguments, and I think there would be very powerful lobbying interests between the sports leagues, which have deals with certain gaming companies, those gaming companies, Native American tribes, and states trying to fight the new regulations that would permit companies like Kalshi to offer products that would displace traditional gaming.
Renato, if there's one thing I'm taking away from today's show is that there are so many more complexities that need to be ironed out. And regardless of the progress that's been made in these few short months, there's still so much that has to be done, so much clarity that's still needed. And so you and I are going to have a job for quite a while longer, I think.
Absolutely. A lot to discuss on here. I'll tell you, this has been such an exciting time to be talking about these topics. And I would just encourage everyone. We're getting lots of comments from viewers that when you give us comments, when you give us feedback, we do take it seriously. I'm reading all your comments during the show, but we appreciate your input afterwards because it really shapes the topics on the questions that we ask in future episodes.
Renato, thank you so much for that. And thank you to our audience for listening, for engaging with us, and for showing up here every other week to join us in, discovering all of the ins and outs of what's going to happen to this industry from a regulatory perspective. I am Jen Sanasi.